All right, here we are for our last lecture on the executive branch. It will be a fairly short one. Basically, I just want to make sure that we understand sort of the outcome of all of the processes that we've talked about, including the structure of the executive branch and its different kinds of agencies, about how bureaucracy operates and how we should expect things to happen. And then finally on those reform processes that you read about in your book. So I pointed this out several other times, but really when we talk about law in the United States, those things that require citizens to do things or bar them from doing things, we're really talking about three different kinds of law. We're talking about legislative law, the laws that Congress proposes, amends, and passes, and the president signs. We're talking about regulatory law, which is what today's lecture is about, how we make regulations in the federal executive branch. And then there are court-made law, which is the interpretations of legislative law based on court decisions. Okay, so bureaucracy and public policy. How are regulations made? Well, it's really this process that is, it happens constantly. And I think that's one of the things that we don't necessarily recognize, is that this process of creating and amending regulations, of changing the ways in which we are required to obey laws, happens all the time. So the first part of making regulations is enabling legislation. So the legislative law that Congress passes and the president signs. So as with many things, there's not necessarily enough instructions, in that legislative law to tell citizens how, or businesses or counties, right, how to obey that law. And so usually within the enabling legislation, it will say, what agency should be the oversight agency. So whether that's a cabinet department or an independent executive agency or an independent regulatory agency, that's who Congress will say, you are the ones who should make the regulations based on this law. And so that agency will publish proposed regulations. And all of those regulations are proposed in the Federal Register, which used to be this just giant book that came out like every month. But now obviously it's online and it's continuously updated. And then there's usually a comment period where there are 60 days in which anyone, citizens, businesses, lobbyists, interest groups, can comment on that proposed regulation, can suggest ways that it should be changed, can suggest that it should be, completely upended, or that they support it, that kind of stuff. And all of that, it asks for, in those proposed regulations, it usually asks for comment. Then after that comment period is over, there is a final regulation that is issued that either is just like the proposed regulation or amended in some way. And then there's a 60-day waiting period before it becomes enforceable, with the idea that at that point, Congress can overturn the regulation, can say, no, that's not what we meant. That's not how we want it to be enforced. And then after that 60 days, the regulation is enforceable, just as legislative law is enforceable. Now, here's the thing. This looks very straightforward, and in a lot of cases it really is. It works like this, but the thing is it's not like businesses and interest groups and lobbyists don't know that this legislation is coming, right? So they've actually spent their time remember this conversation about interest groups when we talked about the provision of program alternatives? Yes, well, interest groups have spent much time, even before you get to, sometimes before the enabling legislation is passed, but in a lot of cases before even the proposed regulations are published, to say, here is how we think it's a good way to have these regulations written and to have this law enforced. And so what you can see here over time is that there's an enormous increase in the number of federal agency rules and regulations over time. So that means there's much more of this conversation that's going on. And the sort of official name for this is what's called negotiated rulemaking. And the argument here, or the idea here, is that affected parties can be involved in the rulemaking process. So yes, in fact, organizations, entities, individuals who are going to be impacted by a regulation can help make that rule. So, and in fact, sometimes the agencies will advertise in the Federal Register for to be an interested party in a particular area of policy, and anybody can apply for that. And so the idea here is that it's a way to both anticipate for those people who are being regulated what future regulations will look like. But it's also another one of those places where it's an information exchange, right? So even among people who are experts in a policy who work for a particular agency, they may not know how a particular policy plays out in a local area, right? In a particular kind of industry. And so that's what negotiated rulemaking is designed to do, right? It still all exists based on the existing legislative law, but the argument is that there are different ways to obey the law. Here's a really good example of this. It's not just about like, oh, hey, we shouldn't have to follow this law. It's more like, hey, can we fill out 3 forms instead of 7 in order to make this process work, right? Like that's one of the things that happens a lot in negotiated rulemaking, is not necessarily the substance of the regulation, but the hoops through which you have to jump in order to follow it. The other piece of this idea is that there are what we would call issue networks, groups of people who are all focused on the same issue or regulatory priority. And these are sort of less obvious because they tend to operate either within Washington, D.C. or within state capitals, and they're not official, but if you are a person who works for an interest group or you work for an agency that is concentrated on a particular kind of issue, like, for example, the Agricultural Products Marketing Bureau of the Department of Agriculture. You're going to end up running into the same people over and over again at places where you can testify, at meetings and things like that. And what ends up happening is lots of times there are what are called issue networks, where people who are creating these regulations know who are the people who have good information, who are the people who are interested in these particular issues and areas. And so a lot of times the networking, the personal relationship part can be really important to this kind of stuff, particularly particularly when you're talking about specific kinds of technical regulations that may be issued by a regulatory agency. So let's think about this relationship between the bureaucracy, the federal agencies, and Congress. Well, remember that Congress funds all of the executive branch agencies. And in theory, they're supposed to perform that oversight function that we talked about last week in Congress. And so members of agencies are frequently lobbying Congress, both for money for their budgets, but also in terms of the technical pieces of bills, right? So members of agencies testify in front of congressional committees during markup periods in order to help get laws written in the ways they think are the best. Why? Because the people in those agencies tend to be experts about those policy issues and to have ideas and plans about how they ought to be created so that they can be implemented more easily by that agency. So let's think about the relationship between the bureaucracy, the federal agencies, and the president. So in theory, most of them report to the president, but in fact, the president does not have direct supervision over all 7 million people who work for the civilian employees who work for the federal government. So in a lot of cases, the people who have been in those agencies for a long time, long-term civil service workers who have seniority and expertise in their own particular policy, they might not be super excited about the person that the president has appointed to head their agency. And so you can see in a lot of cases that the people who are heading the agency, the theory is that they are there to help implement the president's policy positions, they don't always have great success because those appointed officials tend to be there for 2 years or less. And it's pretty easy for someone who has been in the particular agency to have been there for 30 years. So the relationship between the bureaucracy and the presidency, it just sort of depends on who the president is and the kinds of people that they appoint to lead those agencies. Then there are relationships between the bureaucracy and the courts. Why? Well, because the courts can also make decisions and interpretations of regulatory laws, right? So it's not simple. The courts are not just saying, oh, this is what Congress meant. They can also say, oh, here's what this regulation means and how we got to interpret it in light of the legislation behind it or in light of the Constitution. And so agencies are frequently parties to cases in courts. They're frequently sued by citizens, by companies, by interest groups. And then one of the things we're not going to spend a ton of time on, but each of these agencies actually has their own court system inside of them to help adjudicate decisions about their regulatory decisions. This is where you get things like administrative courts for tariffs and trade policy, or administrative courts for environmental protection. So there is definitely a relationship there as part of the federal court system, and those executive branch agencies are sort of an intimate relationship all of the time. So those are the relationships between the bureaucracy and the other parts of government. Here's a way to think about the relationship between citizens and federal agencies, right? So the people have indirect impact over federal agencies by who they're voting for, so by their members of Congress and the president. And they can have some direct impact through the usual suspects of things like public opinion and social movements, but then they can also directly respond to notices in the Federal Register. And so even though many people inside the federal bureaucracy are not directly accountable to voters, their jobs explicitly are designed to help the people, help society, help the country as a whole.